I had a crappy summer. The kind of summer that makes you question what you're doing with your life, why you love the things you love, and how crummy the world can really be. And it's something I still feel uncomfortable about. I began working at a summer camp several years ago. I had history as a camper at this camp, and I loved the place. By the time I was 19, I had done what I had never imagined I'd do and become the camp's one and only medic. As a medic, I no longer hung out with counselors and other young staff as much if I had free time. I spent it helping out in the kitchen. This year, there was a big staff turnover. Our longtime cook moved on from camp and no one was hired over the year as a replacement. So come summertime, we were scrambling to find someone to cover the position. I met two of the interviewees. One, a middle-aged woman who, in my humble opinion, seems like the perfect get-it-done kind of person who you need as a cook, and the other a tall, broad man, mid-40s, with piercings galore. The woman I liked was not chosen. I think my boss was upset by her surprise when she saw how small our kitchen was. 2 ovens to feed 150 people, and the camp was introduced to our new cook, Chef Vincent. Everyone loved Chef Vincent, except for me. The instant I met him, I got chills down my spine. You know when you hear a strange sound in the dark, and your body is screaming at you to run or hide? Yeah, that's how I felt every second I was in the meal hall or in the kitchen. Soon, the places that felt like a second home to me were feeling less comfortable and more, get me the hell out of here. Creepy Chef Vincent was abrasive. My first time speaking with him, he said something like, "That's your medic," in response to my color-dyed hair. He tried to be fancy, but his meals were dull and soggy, and after watching him prepare one, I stopped eating them altogether. I don't think the man had gone to school in his life, let alone taking a food safety course. I survived off an occasional bite of food on the table and ate packaged crackers, bread, and things that he didn't handle directly. I had a storage of cheap meal replacements and drinks in my room. It sucked. I am an extremely protective person, especially of my younger coworkers who were basically family. Chef Vincent's kitchen staff was 16 or 17 years old, and I was afraid for them. I'd watch from outside the kitchen and talk to them discreetly, making sure that everything was okay. Honestly, at this point, I was worried about being unfair since everyone else loved him. Maybe I was the creep, but I couldn't get over the comments that he made and the way he spoke to me. He would touch my shoulder and stand all tall when leaning over me. When he spoke to me and told me about his kids and how they have to stay with their grandma now and about how many years of experience he has, which I always suspected was as a prison cook or something like that, he was extremely arrogant. "It's not my fault that I'm better than the old cook." I wanted to punch him, but eventually I just stopped going to the kitchen. I even stayed away from the mess hall, unless others were in there with me. If he tried to talk to me, which he did often, I ignored him and left the room. But I still thought I was being a bitch, to be honest. One member of the kitchen staff came crying to me about how much he was pushing them around in the kitchen. Soon, all 3 of the kitchen staff were describing incidents of complete disrespect, his refusal to learn their names, use of inappropriate words, and calling them his little girls, and calling the boy all sorts of names. This pushed me until I told the boss how uncomfortable it made me. I didn't bring the kitchen stuff into it since I advised them to tell their boss on their own. Then, one day, a fellow member of staff came up to me and said that Chef Vincent said I won't stop following him and that I should be dating him. Confused and angry, I followed up with another staff member who said that Chef Vincent was talking about the camp dog. Still concerned, I continued with my day. When Chef Vincent called me out and told me the story while laughing with a hand on my shoulder the whole time, he also made wild physical innuendos, constantly. "Oh yeah, I like things hot," and inappropriately complimented me constantly. I got chills every time. This had been going on for a week. In the second week, I'm asleep in the medic's cabin. It's got a bedroom separated from the rest of the office by an unlockable door, and I'm the only one who stays there. My nights are long with lots of sick campers and whatnot. And on this particular night, it's 4 a.m. and I've finally gotten to bed after being up for an hour with a sick kid. I'm exhausted and asleep the second my head hits the pillow. 2 hours later, I'm awakened by a loud thumping at the door. Usually, staff used the walkie-talkies to contact me, even at night, so I'm pretty concerned and I crawl out of bed and head to the door. It's Chef Vincent. I hesitate, not wanting to open the door for him, so he hammers on it again. He looks angry. I'm angry. It's 6 a.m. What does he want? I open the door just a crack and look out. He's loud. I have to do laundry. My office houses the washer and dryer for the camp because I do laundry when kids were at the bed, so every morning laundry is reserved and staff need to ask me to use it. This particular week, we had water problems and the laundry couldn't be done, so I had a lineup of camper things that needed to be washed, and he was here at 6 a.m. demanding to use the wash. When I pointed out the water issues and how campers' stuff comes first, he got aggressive and yanked the door open. He's big and intimidating, and I stepped back to avoid him, looking, and then he said, "I am the important one here." I went cold. It was 6 a.m. I had just been told by this creature from the depths that I, who worked at the camp for 5 years, was unimportant compared to him. It's hard to convey body language secondhand, but he was aggressive. To the degree that I flew past my usual response to this kind of situation, anger, and went straight to fearing for my safety. I can be an anxious person, but I don't get genuinely frightened by a lot of things. So what scared me more was how scared I was. Adrenaline pumping scared. His gaze was absolutely predatory. There was nothing about his presence that made me think he saw me other than something to be toyed with. At this point, my mouth was opened, and I knew I'd say something I'd regret saying, especially locked in the building alone with the one man who creeped the hell out of me from the second I met him. So I forced one word out, "Okay," and backed away to my room. He watched me the whole time. I got to my room. I am tired of this frustration, of this anger, of this fear. I warned my boss about him. Boss was always saying to listen to your gut, and I was, but did they do anything about it? No. I pushed a chair against the doorknob, not knowing if it actually works to lock doors like in the movies, and curled up in my bed. I told my boss the following morning, and they called it inappropriate and said that it wouldn't happen again, but that was all I heard. For the next week, I lived in constant anxiety, which meant puking a lot and hiding in my room. When he talked to me, he had a smile that would make even the most dafter people pause for concern. While before this, I had attempted to be polite, I always just left the room. The following week, all of the staff members were relocated to the upstairs area to ensure their safety, except for a few staff members who were responsible for monitoring the children in their cabins. At some point during that week, a fellow upper-level staff member informed me that Chef Vincent was fired. His background check, which they didn't decide to do until after he was hired, came back. He didn't pass his vulnerable sector check, aka he was not allowed to work with or volunteer with kids in any capacity due to prior crimes. I'll let you mull that over. Camp was effectively on lockdown, and he was to vacate the premises immediately. I lost it, and the tears came and wouldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. My whole body went numb, and I was led out of the building by another upper-level staff member, where I managed to gobble out some stuff along the lines of how he made me so anxious, and no one else saw it. I'm just so relieved. The panic attack lasted for a solid 30 minutes. When I saw him exit the building with his belongings, I hid in my office, and when I came out, he was gone. They kept it all under wraps. They didn't tell the kids that the cook is gone now. They didn't tell the parents just in case something had happened. My boss didn't even tell the board of directors. It was a huge liability, and it still is, And whilst I'm glad that my anxieties about the man were completely justified, I am filled with anger over the fact that he was hired without a criminal record check, and the fact that my feelings were repeatedly dismissed. Camp went from being the only place in the world where I felt completely safe and comfortable to a strange place where I felt I was living a never-ending nightmare. I felt inadequate and constantly upset. It's funny how having your fears ignored can make you feel as if there's something wrong with you. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore and quit on account of my mental health so I could see a professional more often. I still have fears about the man finding me, which I feel is irrational because he never actually abused me or anything, just made me feel like crap with myself and made me feel anxious and was incredibly aggressive and physically inappropriate. My parents joking about it being a Cape Fear kind of situation and laughing about it makes it feel better, but only for a little bit. I don't think they realize just how terrified I was and still am. So creepy chef with a criminal record and predatory eyes who decided to spend his summer working at a kid's camp. Let's not meet again.
A couple of years ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Pacific Northwest, between San Francisco and Portland. We had rented a car and were stopping at different campsites every night on our way from the former to the latter. The first night we arrived at a campsite, we found that it had been closed for the season, despite the fact that we looked on their website and they said that they were open. So we ended up driving around looking for another campsite on Google Maps. But at this point, it was getting dark. We saw a forest firefighter outpost and pulled in to ask them if they knew of any nearby campgrounds. They told us that most of them were closed for the season, but there were a couple on their old map that we hadn't checked. We got back on the road and found our way to one of these campsites. The sign for this place is literally resting on the ground and is a little overgrown, but at this point it's dark as hell, and we really don't have many other options. As we pull our car into what we think is a spot, we see a few other tents nearby, so we take it as a good sign. We get out and start to set up our things when immediately things begin to get strange. Two guys walk directly through our spot and strike up a conversation with us. They're looking a little rough. One of them has a zip-up hoodie without a shirt underneath, and I noticed that he is extremely skinny. They're also both really dirty and have messed up hair. They're both speaking very fast and seemed kind of nervous. They tell us that they're actually seasonal workers nearby, and they're staying at this campsite to save money whilst they're there. While we're talking to these two guys, a decade-old white Mercedes pulls into the campsite with all four windows blasting rap music. The driver and passenger looked like some real ICP enthusiasts. They look around quickly and leave immediately. At the time, I thought they were probably looking for a campsite. The two rough dudes also leave, and we continue setting up camp. Not too long after, we get another visitor. This time, it's an older woman with a 3-pack-a-day voice. She's nice enough, but also asking us some pretty weird questions. "You guys here for the horror show?" she asks. I'm thinking, what's a horror show? "Do you mean the haunted house?" She tells us that lots of people come out for the horror show and starts warning us about all the ghouls and zombies. She eventually leaves, and my girlfriend and I agree they must be talking about some kind of haunted house nearby, as it was early October, and maybe that's where the seasonal worker dudes who looked kind of scary happened to be working at. It all checked out in my mind. We start our fire, and I begin breaking out the wood when my girlfriend admits that she's freaked out. She's worried about the people that we've encountered and how strange this campsite is. She points out that there's no sound coming from anyone else's tents with the exception of the one woman who wouldn't stop coughing. No music, no children, laughter, nothing. I'm starting to believe her, but at this point, it's pretty late, and we don't really have any other options. I'm also thinking that if the campsite is weird, it's just some harmless weirdos. She seems pacified by my confidence, and we continue making dinner. It's at this point a bunch of really weird shit starts happening. The two dudes we met right when we got there emerge from the woods without any source of light and without saying a word, walking straight into their tent. They have a very short and heated discussion, which I can't make out. One of them storms out of the tent and walks straight towards the older woman's campsite, making eye contact with me for an uncomfortably long amount of time. He then climbs into the cab of her pickup truck, and I realize there's already someone in there and likely has been for some time, probably the woman. You can tell that they start smoking something from when the lighter flickers. This strikes me as especially odd. You smoke cigarettes in the car? Probably not hot. We're at a campsite in Northern California, and I'm pretty sure there aren't any kids around. Why go into the car to do that? Then it hits me like a sack of bricks. It's meth. They were all smoking meth, and the woman was probably dealing. The level of comfort she had established in her campsite indicated that she'd been there for a while. Meth explained why everyone was looking like emancipated zombies. They explained the juggalos driving through, getting spooked and leaving. They explained the strange, erratic behavior and constant coughing from everyone. This was clearly some sort of live-in meth village at a closed-down campsite in the backwoods of Northern California. It's at this moment that I realize the second guy is skulking around the edge of our campsite, clearly trying not to be seen. I admit to my girlfriend that I also wanted to leave. We packed up everything very slowly and normally, trying to make it look like we were just putting away food and putting our fire out for the night, with only the tent left. I tell my girlfriend to get into the car and get ready to back out of the spot. The second I pick up the tent, the woman's truck starts up and her lights turn on. They were blindingly bright circular lights on a rack. I throw the tent into the trunk as fast as I can, and I tell my girlfriend to back up. I'm standing behind the car to guide her, but also making it very clear to whoever's watching us that I have a hatchet. I was so on edge that if Mr. Rogers caught me off guard, I would have buried that thing into his skull. She throws the car in reverse, hits the pedal, but the car doesn't move. I can hear the engine revving, and I see the car lurching, but it's not going anywhere. For a split second, I think they've slashed our tires somehow. This is how horror movies start. Suddenly it hits me. The parking brake is likely on. As she backs up, gets on the main path, and I jump in the passenger seat, we can hear them start screaming about something. Once we get onto the main road, we do a Chinese fire drill, and I drive down the road at warp speed to the first bed and breakfast that we see. It was lovely to be away from the horror show.
Let me preface this by saying I am by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in paranormal ghosts, demons, or aliens, or whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween. I have to admit, it's had me scratching my head ever since. So, we had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighborhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas drop off in ours and constantly parade at our door. That night, I'd say we had no more than 8 to 10 groups of kids. It was around 9:30, and my husband and I were sitting in our family room, watching some of the ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but I do like a good ghost story now and then. And it is Halloween, after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over half an hour. It was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light on and let our dog, Chloe, out of her crate. I also didn't want her scaring or intimidating the kids because she can be a little scary, so I turned the outside light off. Let Chloe out, and she followed me back to the couch and lay down on my feet. It was getting close to 10 p.m. when my husband decides he's had enough fun for the night and was going to go upstairs, take a shower, and get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday, and he still had to get up early for the next day. Our teenage son was out with his friends at the local haunted house and wasn't expected back for at least another hour or so. That left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean that those shows don't freak me out. And being alone now, I have to say, I was kind of on edge watching the TV. It wasn't long until I heard the upstairs shower turn on. When the light came on in the patio, knock, knock, knock at the front door, my initial reaction was, "What the hell, really? It's almost 10 o'clock. Go on." But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why then? Not our doorbell? Glows in the dark, and without the porch light it would have been extra obvious to everyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door had a big glass panel, and everyone right by the door could easily see inside and know that I was just sitting there watching TV. It would have been rude for me not to answer. Just before I get up, knock, knock, knock again from the door. I glanced down at Chloe, but she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room and found her crouching by the back door like she was wanting out. However, she needed to ask to go out like that. She always comes to lick my hand or puts her head on my knee. This was very out of character for her, and I have to say it heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, crate," I said. She just turned back to look at me like, "Hell no, lady." I yelled up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, knock, knock. About the time a car drove by our street and cast enough light on the door for me to see the silhouettes of two small children through the glass, I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably a couple of my neighborhood, on their way back home and wanted to stop by and show me their costumes. I headed for the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't following. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself. She just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass. It was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and began to wonder about what kind of parents would let their kids run around the streets this late at night. I opened the door enough to see where I could block Chloe's escape if she decided to grow some balls, which was only about 2 feet. What struck me immediately as odd was that the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were wearing normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick-or-treat either. I began to feel very uneasy. It was a girl and a boy. They stood to my left. The older one was around 11 or 12. I could tell she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features, as our lights are from high above and on the columns at the front of the porch, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I have no idea a door wide enough for any of their light to come inside and hit them. The boy was younger, about a foot shorter, and between 8 or 9, I'd say, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can we please come inside and use your phone to call our mother?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me that something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time I'd had anyone ask me to use my home phone. Don't you have a phone of your own that you can call your mom?" Odd, I asked this, and that is when things got really weird. Both kids turned to look at one another as if they were going to say something, but neither ever spoke. They both turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here, and my brother is scared." I have to admit, there were 2 competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart, wanting to help these 2 small children get to their mother. The other, a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then I noticed that during the short conversation, I had already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and they looked at each other again. After a short moment, they turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside whilst you call our mother?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer to the door, almost as if she was going to walk in. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, she had black eyes. That's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror I don't think I've ever felt before in my life. I could feel every hair on my arm and back of my neck standing up. I closed the door to where my face was just able to stick out. The little girl stopped again and pleaded, "Please, ma'am, we're really scared and alone out here. We have to come inside. Please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when their fear took over and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mom if you give me the number," I shouted through the door. "But I'm not letting you in my house." I could still see them standing there on the porch, just staring at me through the Bellevue glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but the bigger part didn't want to lose track of where they were. That would have freaked me out even more, to know that they were not there. After what seemed like forever, probably a few seconds, I decided to call my neighbor, who lived across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to get my phone, I glanced back to the door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room, under the bed. When I got my phone and started to look for his contact info, it was when the kids stepped away from the door and had began walking into the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look of who they were and where they went. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough detail to make out people's shapes, but you couldn't see much detail. Of course, standing there close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone looking in from the door. I could see that the kids were standing under the street lamp nearest to my house, staring at me as I lifted the phone to my ear. After calling them, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbor out under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, and I had never even heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think, what I have to think, is that these kids were just yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them, they were really, really good at it, and they scared the shit out of me and my dog. Let's not meet again.
A few years ago, I was driving across the country and stopped at Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park to camp for the night. I got in around 4 p.m. and, eager to experience the redwoods for the first time, started out on a 7-mile trail run through the park. This was early November, so I knew that I had about an hour and a half until sunset, which I thought was plenty of time for the run. If you've been to the redwoods, you know that the terrain is steep, with narrow valleys and, of course, unfathomably giant trees. Twilight came early and my pace slowed as the light dwindled. Soon I was walking, just barely able to discern the path. This was the start of a situation, but I knew that I would be warm enough if I kept moving. So I concentrated on staying on the path and absorbing the forest's presence. It was incredibly quiet. I perhaps heard 1 or 2 bird calls the whole time, but not spooky for lack of a better term. I got a sense of peaceful dignity that existed entirely separate from my human-sized concerns. With maybe 2 or 3 miles left in my walk-run back to the campsite, I rounded a bend and came upon a silvery, glowing orb right in the middle of the trail. I held my eyes closed. Was this a trick of my night vision into the fading twilight? But the Yule was still there when I opened them. After staring at it for some amount of time, I cautiously stuck my hand into it. I didn't feel anything. No, I half expected a sensation of heat, or maybe a tingling, but I distinctly remember how the details of my hand appeared in the silvery light. I traced the outline with my hand and couldn't bring myself to step through it. Eventually I grew cold and realized I needed to continue. As I was looking for a way around it, I saw the moon just peeking above the ridge. That's when I realized what it was. I had been playing with a moonbeam that disappeared into the depths of the steep valley. The terrain and rising moon had created a sort of illusion that made it look like a glowing orb was floating in the middle of the trail. It was beautiful, yet explainable. I will always hold on to how I felt rounding the bend and seeing that. It wasn't fear, just a keen sense of my surroundings, with a sudden openness to experiencing something incredibly beautiful, even if it defined my understanding of the world.
I was on top of an old unused AT&T microwave transmitting tower. You can see for miles and miles and miles up there. I can't remember exactly how tall the tower was, but definitely between 100 and 150 feet. I was replacing a 900 megahertz antenna. The company I worked for was going to start a Wi-Fi broadband business nearby and needed this antenna to transmit the signal over the mountain. We had been up there 6 or 7 times already, and when we went on the tower, we would regularly see deer. Once I saw a black bear with 2 cubs. It was late autumn, so there were not a lot of leaves on the trees, giving me a pretty clear view through the canopy. I had just climbed the ladder to the top of the tower and hauled up the tools and new antenna. I laid down to catch my breath and ended up just chillin' for about 30 minutes. I wasn't in a hurry when I started hearing some noise from the woods below. A bit further along the ridge, I was just looking in that direction trying to figure out what was making the racket when I noticed some animals or something come along the ridge. A group of 4 huge Sasquatch walked out of the woods and into the clearing by the tower and followed the fence line to the other side of the tower. I guess they didn't see me because they just kept trucking it along the ridge. I'm aware that this sounds crazy, and I get that from everyone I've told this story to. To be fair, the things could have been people in very convincing costumes. From the top of the tower, it's hard to judge the size of something from the ground without anything around it for scale. My car was on the other side of the small building at the base, and I couldn't see it. So maybe they weren't as large as they appeared, although I have no clue why anyone would be in the woods on the top of the mountain miles away from the nearest road wearing a giant full-body costume. There's not a lot of people coming to the tower to work, maybe once a month at best, and no one knew that I was going to be there on that day. So it makes no sense to plan that kind of elaborate hoax at that location. There are houses relatively close to the tower, but not along the ridge. And either way, whether it was a group of real Sasquatch or weird people in the middle of nowhere dressed up as Sasquatch, that was not something I wanted to be a part of. I kept my mouth shut and didn't move for another 30 minutes and listened until I didn't hear the sound of them in the distance. I replaced the antenna and kept as quiet as possible. When I was done, I snuck down the tower and drove the hell out of there as fast as I could.